You're from America originally?
I am. I'm from Ohio.
That's a classic expat move, Ohio to Portugal, right?
Well, it's kind of become one.
Really?
It's kind of becoming one. Yeah. I mean, I did the more classic one for a while, which was the U.S. to Berlin. I was in. I lived all around the United States, and then eventually I wound up in and out of Ohio, obviously where the book takes place. And then I wound up in New York City. I was in New York City for about 15 years, and eventually wound up in Berlin. Was full time in Berlin, more or less 10 years, and my partner is from Lisbon, so we eventually made our way here.
But you're always feeling the pull of the Rust Belt, asking you to come back home.
Totally, and I'm happy to feel that pull. I come home as often as I can, which is only about once a year at this point. But I love going back to the Rust Belt and the U.S. in general and to Ohio.
So the book we're reading now, which is going to be 2 books after yours, is by Stephen Markley. It's a book called The Deluge, but he wrote a book called Ohio, right?
He did write a book called Ohio.
Have you read? Are you aware of that book?
I am aware of that book, and that book was gifted to me at some point by my sister, who's also a big bookhead, and I got into Ohio and the book and never finished it, I will admit. Okay. So I can't. I'm well aware of the book and read a lot about it, and it got a lot of attention. And it wasn't quite my thing in terms of the style and everything, but
because our podcast is themed into different seasons, and so your book falls into our eco module, which I have my first real question about in a little bit. But in between those, we're doing mini modules about each different state, and so I would assume I have no control or say over the books, which I am very happy about. So he picks all the books for us, but I think we have not gotten to Ohio yet. But question: are there books set in Ohio? As someone from Ohio, are there books set in or take place in Ohio that you feel capture the state?
I think mine certainly does in its own way, and that was its sort of stated intent was to capture a certain dimension of the state. I think from what I read of Ohio, it really does capture the sort of complexity of the this sort of Ohio small town experience and the way that it's networked to global events in this really kind of catastrophic personal way. From what I know about the book Ohio, I mean there are those books by and I'm totally gonna flub this up now, but books by the Southern Ohio writer Winesburg, Ohio.
Sherwood Anderson. Sure, yeah.
There's another set of books by, this is what I'm going to flub up, by a guy who was working in Donald Ray Pollock. Donald Ray Pollock wrote a couple of books about Southern Ohio that I think are pretty on the nose about certain aspects of the state. Yeah.
It's definitely a state that has we'll get off Ohio in a second.
I don't mind. I can talk about Ohio all day and night, especially since I'm not there. So, you get that long view of a place when you're not there.
Well, and, it's a state similar to Florida that I think the majority of Americans don't think about that much, but then it has this sort of outsized influence on national politics every 4 years or so.
Yeah.
Right. And then it's everyone's racing for that Ohio vote and ends up being whatever Ohio does ends up being this huge deal.
Yeah, that's true. It was certainly that way for a while. I think the last election, or maybe in the last election, the winner of Ohio did not win the nation, and that's the first time that's happened in many, many, many years. I can't remember how long, but Ohio was the bellwether state forever.
Which is crazy to think about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's it's an interesting place because that's actually sort of on the surface. Ohio is really, on the surface, is very boring in a way. It's the Midwest. It's cornfields and soybean fields and college towns and suburbs. and then a lot of new white collar industry, and then the Rust Belt and the Appalachian sort of corners of it, that in spite of that sort of boring surface, or, you know, compared to other states like New York or California or even Florida, which are just sort of, you know, always eye-popping, you know, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, they have alligators, which is
they have a lot. They've got a lot going on, you know. But Ohio's actually, what I was going to say is that Ohio demographically, or the way that it works, particularly in terms of electoral politics, is actually quite complex in a small area, because you have the largest amount of colleges in one state, the largest amount of college towns, therefore, plus like four major urban centers, plus all this farm country, plus an enormous amount of suburbs. So it's a super purple state, and the way that you know kind of divides out over the yeah.
It's asking for a lot of dialectic energy. There are tensions that need to be resolved constantly.
It is. Those, I think, now with the way things are in the last election cycle and the new one, that's just kind of, you know, everything's bonkers now. So everything's changing up a bit, and I think Ohio is no longer quite the bellwether that it was, because I'm not sure anywhere is
right
anymore. You know, the internet has changed that a lot. This, you know, there's really no longer this rural urban divide anymore, which is sort of what my book was about, that line in the, you know, that geographic line sort of being disrupted, you know. But
yeah, because I want to ask about that, because like I was saying, we theme our seasons around a different idea or concept, and so we're doing the eco module right now, so things about the environment, ecology, and I was wondering if, because there's a weird thing that happens to us that when we read a book, you know, you had not read this before,
I hadn't.
So we assume like what we've read about a thing or we know about a thing would fit in this thing, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily fall into a module the way that we sort of thought it would. So like we go into these things assuming or expecting this to be like an eco book or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think your book could fall into a lot of different modules that we have covered, will cover, etc. But was that a theme? Like if you were sort of theming or slating into other sort of like reading books around yours, is eco environment a theme that you would like gravitate towards? Are there other things that you think would make more sense as like the way to sort of approach this from a first time reader?
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought about that actually when you brought it up as being included in your eco module, because I would actually say not in this particular case. I mean, like you said, it can fit a lot of different categories, which was also sort of its positioning in the process of making it, was sort of to take this kind of comprehensive view at the time of a very specific place, which certainly included an eco awareness. In the case of this particular book, the eco descriptor is a little bit too specific for what the book is. I mean, did you feel that way, that it sort of did not then kind of fit the module exactly as you might have imagined?
Well, I think there's a sort of like determinism to the way that we do it, which is like once we start reading something through a certain lens, it ends up coloring the way that we look at it, which might be like a totally flawed way at going into looking at a book. So when we were reading it, I was thinking, you know, we think a lot about like the eco aspects of it, but also like with your book, the thing that I walked away thinking about it much more than content was form.
Yeah.
I thought about it much more as stylistically and the choices made through that lens.
Right.
Then I ended up thinking about it as an eco book. The eco stuff was kind of a way in.
Yeah, and it's sort of lingering. It's sort of hovering there in and around things. By the way, I just want to say I'm really you know, delighted that you guys wanted, you know, that you picked up the book and wanted to talk about it. It's such a sort of under the radar book that's been out for, you know, almost 10 years now. So just to, you know, thanks. It's
what's all him. That's he does the deep diving, the deep digging.
Part of what I did. I like as you noted and as you noticed, like I like the $2 radio books. I like them as like an whoever's in charge over there, I like what they've got going on aesthetically.
Yeah.
So I basically like can pick anything from their catalog, and if it fits something and I haven't read it, I'll be like, oh yeah, let's include this, because it is generally more fun to read books from independent presses, and then there's also much more frequently you have the opportunity to actually talk to authors than like, you know, if we read like a Stephen King book, it's like, who really number one, Stephen King doesn't need us. Not, like he doesn't, like, we're a blip on whatever. Like any sort of signal boosting that we can do for anyone is great, and plus signal boosting for $3 or $2 radio, which is a great press, and then, you know, the other authors involved there too. So
yeah, they're great. I will say that straight away, that they're just fantastic, and they're fantastic to work with. And the way that I worked with them specifically was really organic and just awesome. They're running a great outfit between the publishing and the headquarters bookshop that they now have, and they're just super. So.
How did you get involved with them? I know is your background as a filmmaker?
But my background was as an actor and also a writer and collaborative artist, and the way that I got involved with $2 radio was quite funny, actually, because I was doing all these things. I was living in New York City at the time, after having spent many years in Ohio and in other parts of the country, and I was doing a lot of theater and doing some sort of indie, really under the radar film stuff, and some more on the radar film stuff, but in the New York art world, which was a whole other thing. But I had also written this screenplay that I had a whole sort of life with in Ohio and New York and Los Angeles as well, which was the screenplay for the original manuscript of The Glacier of the book. And what happened was that I was living in New York at the time, or maybe going back and forth between Ohio and New York and Berlin already as well. And my grandmother, who I was very close with, who was approaching 90 at the time, would always cut out articles from the local paper in Columbus, Ohio, and sort of, either mail them to me or call me up and say, like grandmas do, cut out newspaper clippings and say, I thought of you, and I thought of you, or I thought you would be interested in this. So one time she did that. It happened to be a profile that the other paper, or the Columbus Alive, one of the cultural newspapers in Columbus, Ohio, ran a profile on $2 radio. And they had their publishing operation up for at least a few years already, I guess. And they were starting to get into what they were calling microfilm production. Super, super, super low budget film production, which they were calling micro budget filmmaking. So they talked about that. And my grandmother called me up and said, hey, I really think you should go talk to these guys.
Love that.
I was like, okay, thanks, Grandma. And she really had this sense about, and she was right. I wrote to Eric, who runs $2 Radio, and he likes to tell this story because I just dumped everything on him. I was already doing other weird stuff in New York, and I was also trying to get a sort of another kind of writing life going on, and I was doing all kinds of different things across different arts disciplines, and I just kind of like threw everything at Eric that I was doing, like everything in the kitchen sink, and he read like this way too long email from me with like all these links and all this stuff. And when we talked about it later, he was like, and I was really delighted to find out that you weren't, a super weird stalker serial, because I just like, I just threw, one of those emails that I just threw everything at him.
Yeah, like an email that maybe could be written on the wall of a mental hospital in Phoenix.
I mean, not quite. I don't think it was a deranged email. It was just a lot to throw at somebody over an introductory, But the kind of the gist of it was basically like, look, it looks like what you guys are doing is really cool. It kind of intersects with a lot of things that I'm doing. I don't have a novel to give you guys right now. I don't have any idea how we might work together, but I see you're doing these microfilm productions or trying to get into them. And so I just wanted to like reach out and contact you. And by the way, I have this weird screenplay. So I sent him all this stuff. We actually met and had coffee, had a really nice meeting and chat in Columbus. And I gave him this manuscript. Didn't hear from him again for a couple of years. And then a couple of years later, he wrote to me and said, hey, I'm doing this film with Nick Rombies up in Detroit, who wrote The Absolution of Roberto Estes Lang, another great $2 radio novel. And he wrote the screenplay, and we'd like you to be in it, in this film. And I had a hole in our catalog for next year, or our lineup for next year, and I dug your script out of my pile and read it again, and we want to publish it.
That's awesome.
I was flabbergasted. You know, it was really because of the mileage that I'd already gone through with the script already, sort of in Hollywood and in New York, and I'd kind of put it in a drawer and said, okay, this is done now. And then sort of right when I did that, you know, he kind of called me up and said, let's make this into a book. You know?
Yeah, how much work did it take to adapt it from a screenplay into the form that we read? Because it's kind of written, I mean, much more so than any other book we've covered for the podcast and most that I've ever read, like written more like a screenplay than most other things. Like there's still like that foundation of it, but how much work was it to translate from the one medium to the other?
It was not a lot of work, to be honest. Number one, it was really smooth working with Eric and Eliza as editors. And we sort of just agreed on things really fast. I mean, there were a couple options about how to go about it, like take the screenplay and take all of my reams of sort of notes on it and then maybe drawings and images and make kind of like an art book out of it, or which would have been sort of a big, cool, messy kind of art book kind of thing, or go the really streamlined sort of route that we did. And that when we decided to do that, or when Eric sort of decided that would be the way to go, this happened really quickly. You know, we made certain structural changes to make it sort of flow a little better as prose on the page without all the like scene headings and interior this, exterior that, cuts, all these things. We just sort of like finessed it into something that would flow a little more as prose on the page. And I also used the opportunity to go through and make, you know, whatever sort of minor content. Yeah, so it wasn't a huge, you know, he really wanted to maintain the idea. He decided to call it a cinematic novel as it is, rather than like an adapted screenplay. Or obviously we didn't really want to just call it a novel because as you pointed out, the structure of it is really important to the content. You know, the form really speaks to the way that it operates. And I really wanted it to continue to operate that as sort of I've always thought of it as kind of a blueprint for something else, like a blueprint for something that it isn't. You know, it's a blueprint for a movie, which it is not. And it's also sort of a schematic for a more possibly flushed out prose novel, which it also is not. Yeah. So it's kind of this thing that it isn't. And I wanted it to operate that way in terms of the relationship between language and words on the page, and actually being able the fact that those mechanics generate images in your head and hopefully sounds in your encounter with black ink on the page. That was really important to me, and I think is also integral to the content of the script as well, as a projection of a projection kind of thing.
Yes, I mean, something that we talked about a lot was the aesthetic difference in reading something that has so much white space on a page, as opposed to something that, you know, you get these dense blocks of texts, and that's like it's a different emotional experience reading something like that. It like your entire body processes language in a completely different way based on the delivery system. Most of us, myself included, don't really read screenplays. Yeah. So there's something about that delivery system that it opens up an imagistic world in a way that like you're more like dense prose dense novels don't necessarily do, because in those novels you're maybe thinking about the language and the descriptors as opposed to allowing it to be projected as images. Does that make sense? Or is that like a crazy person thing to say?
I think so completely. And I think still I don't know how your experience was with reading it. I mean, a lot of people, that's really unsatisfying for them to have that so much white space on the page, or this character is underdeveloped because I leave it sort of as something that's happening in space, or something that would have been happening as an image that I'm not going to fill in with more prose. Right. I'm not going to fill in the so some readers find that really unsatisfying. Other people really appreciate that minimalism and sort of the haiku structure of it. I always sort of thought of it as a haiku structure for a film, in a way that, because I never, at the same time that it doesn't sort of fulfill sort of qualities that prose novels ideally fulfill, I also wasn't really interested in fulfilling certain things that most screenplays are supposed to fulfill, particularly sort of in the period that it was coming out of in the 90s, when story and storytelling really became this huge industry catchphrase necessity, that the storytelling is the thing. And I really wasn't interested in, and that's not to say that story-told screenplays or story-told movies are necessarily bad. Of course they're not. But I just wasn't interested in that. I wasn't interested in telling a story, so to speak, in ways that are narratively satisfying, that most screenplays are sort of obliged to adhere to. I was more interested in creating these vignettes and sort of set pieces that would be in relation to each other as a kind of faceted whole, and maybe the whole is never apparent, but is there in the sort of faceted relationship between these.
But there's an intentional opaqueness to it, and like an intentional poetry to it that you can't, that if you filled in those blanks, or like if you took these sort of like, I'm thinking of like the sort of, I might be getting the words wrong, but there's like sort of this atavistic mud man creature thing. But if you went and you spent a paragraph explaining explicitly what that was, you would remove the magic from that moment, right?
Ideally, I mean, it's nice that that you put it that way. Yeah, because you certainly could do that. There were points where that was maybe tempting. I think maybe I also wasn't up for that. I really wanted to see something that would kind of hopefully have the resonance of that magic on its own, and also therefore the what it may or may not mean. Yeah, there is an intention. I wouldn't call it intentional opacity. I was never intentionally trying to be difficult or intentionally trying to be opaque. But there was an intentional sort of, how can I continually circle this thing that I'm seeing, that I'm trying to see, that I want other people to encounter as this kind of circling that I can't say directly, or I didn't know how, at least at the time, to say directly. I felt it was just this kind of circling, or in the case of the Mudman, just presenting it for what it is, as this sort of symbolic object in a way, or symbolic character in a way.
Speaking of symbolism, I think this also goes back to the eco module. The title, The Glacier, again, framing it within a eco module, we're like, oh, it must be about like rising water levels, or it must be about this or that or whatever. And like, there's none of that. And you can also tell me to F off, and you're not going to explain what it means or answer the question, but we have some ideas about like what the title could refer to. But where did the title "The Glacier" come from?
Yeah, this is actually super upfront, and I can be completely transparent about that. It was really, it was really growing up in Central Ohio and growing up in a pretty archetypal Midwestern small college town, in the nicest sense, and also in sort of the Twin Peaks sense of this church-going community that has its sort of all its different sides. Anyway, I grew up in this really kind of quintessential Midwestern small town, 100-year-old houses. And during the 90s there was the housing boom in the mid 90s. There was a housing boom in Central Ohio, and the suburban development that took place in Central Ohio was, I think, neck and neck with the development that was happening around Las Vegas as the highest rate of development of new housing in the country, of single family homes and single family lots, and this massive, very rapid suburban development. And it was something that was really shocking and very overnight transformation of the landscape, where you had all these family farms for miles and miles being overturned to being sold to developers. And so this certainly gets into eco themes of it's thematic to the module, but it also just had to do with sort of aesthetic shock and awe, in a way, at seeing the geology of this place that we had known and grown up in be overturned overnight in a really, really massive way. And I started calling it the Glacier because all the homes were vinyl siding, white and beige and off-white and different shades of beige. And it was this thing that you would just see pop up everywhere. And you felt that it was this kind of thing, like you'd wake up the next morning and it would have progressed 10 meters or something. Like it really became this kind of entity. And I called it the Glacier. And my friends, in the community of artists and musicians that I was with at the time then in Central Ohio, we all started calling it the Glacier. I kind of got obsessed with the concept of it and the other ways that sort of I was experiencing the manifestation of this overturning of the cultural economy in the Midwest into this really striking and monumental suburban economy that would eventually have, this was pre-internet, it was pre-cell phone, mid 90s, so it's not pre the existence of internet, but pre the internet as we know it
today. Yeah.
It's pre cell phone and everything. And so I kind of dove in deeper and deeper into this encounter which to me was an encounter with a spaceship. A spaceship had landed in Central Ohio, an encounter with this alien presence and this alien architecture, which is super, super familiar architecture. So here you have a very, very familiar phenomena that is so infrastructurally expansive that it renders itself as alien. And these things were just very captivating to me. And so I just ended up spending a lot of all my time with that. And that's where the title comes from. It's sort of looking at the whole thing as a geologic event that's happening very slowly and very in slow motion, but very quickly at the same time.
It does. That makes me think of it more explicitly as an environmental novel, because I was thinking there are many moments inside the book where you mentioned the houses springing up and specifically the vinyl siding. That's an image that comes to mind as well. And I think of like my hometown, for example, It was a farming community on the Jersey Shore, and just during the time of my life, it has changed so rapidly into McMansion suburb stuff, and then on the beach explicitly after Hurricane Sandy, all the regular houses are gone, and then they put up these condominiums that are all aesthetically similar, and they're all aesthetically disgusting. There's no like. They have no individual personality. And there's something about the stripping of nature, which is inevitably beautiful, and replacing it with like this capitalist aesthetic version of like, let's put up the fastest, cheapest things possible. Let's replace this beauty with something that is not only ugly, but it's also bad for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think in this case, the layers of stripping had already happened several times. You know, this isn't the first time this had happened. They were already all cornfields and soybean fields.
Right.
They'd once been old growth forests that had been cleared. They became second growth forests, and then those had been cleared. And before that, of course, it was native country. And so I wanted to explore all those layers of stripping, because at a certain point, I also was interested. It sort of led me to consider, maybe for the first time as an adult as an artistic encounter, like, what does it mean to be native? What does it mean to be? I'm a native Ohioan, but what does that mean to be native? If there's been so much stripping here over centuries, that you're kind of dealing with a strippable template to begin with, that there's no there beneath it, that you're not starting from anything anyway. So this, in a way, so that the spaceship lands in a place that it's already engineered for itself, kind of as if Halliburton were self-colonizing the U.S., which is sort of how I eventually came to think of things much later, the way that.
I also love the metaphor that you just made about sort of the geologic pacing or the glacial pacing of something, because when things that as big as glaciers move or something, it's like nothing seems like it's happening, and time passes, and then all of a sudden everything has already happened, and it just seems like there's almost feels like an inevitability to it. That's terrifying.
And where else is that stripping happening? Because it's a stripping that's happening on the landscape, in this geologic sense, but it's also happening internally, and it's happening, whether you're someone who's going to end up living in one of those houses, or somebody who's commuting through them, or somebody whose family farm was converted into one of those developments. But the stripping's happening on the inside too, and that's certainly something that I was really preoccupied with. What does that stripping look like? What does it mean for society? What does it eventually mean for food, for animals, for electoral politics, for kids in schools, for what does this configuration of lawn do to people? Obviously, I didn't flush all that out in this particular work, but I wanted to look at it. I wanted to create situations that would sort of bring all that into play into these theatrical moments that were, sort of strung together.
And also the crafting of them as theatrical moments and images makes it not pedantic, which is like always the danger of like big metaphors and things like that, is like if you get in there and you're too like explaining about it or something, then your reader is going to be like, this guy's trying to teach me a fucking lesson. I have no interest in that,
Well, I hope I'm not. I hope I'm.
Oh no,
not.
I don't think you are at all. I think.
Yeah, I never wanted to do that. I mean, there were on the other hand, there's certain aspects of the prose that are intend to be super, super clear, like about the vinyl siding. I just want to paint a picture of what this looks like. And so this is really sort of economical, possibly pedantic, but really more economical. And beyond that, I didn't actually want to tell an eco story any more than I wanted to tell an architectural story, or eventually, a story that sort of gets into pre-internet reality and society of the spectacle, sort of media, exoskeletal media kind of apparatus, toward the end of the book, which was why I was resisting narrative as well, in a way, because I just wanted to be specific. I wanted to be specific about how I was experiencing, which for me actually involved, at a certain point, I got a job as a land surveyor.
I was going to ask if you could tell me what a land surveyor does, because I'm not really sure.
That was like a minute of our episode. Just like Bob's like, I don't know what they do.
I'm not really sure.
Well, a land surveyor is the guy that you see on the side of the road with a tripod, looking through the scope. And there's a guy.
What are you looking at, though?
There's a guy at the other end of that scope. And so a lot of this stuff in the book didn't make sense to you, I guess, because
I definitely missed some of it.
It felt like the kind of thing where, like, sometimes you read a book or watch a movie about people doing a job. You're like, I know this makes sense. It's just beyond my grasp. So, like, it didn't negatively impact, but just like, I don't know what they're doing. Like, we know the type of work they're doing, but not the physical actual what they're doing.
And this is something that sort of really suffers in the sense of in the structural sense of minimalistic prose.
But also also just know that, like, we don't like we don't like answers. Like, we want lack of meaning. Like, this is exactly what we want in a book. So none of this should be received as criticism. This is all just like explain a thing that we should already know because we are adults, but we don't understand what this is.
Yeah, well, it's actually super cool. I mean, what the surveyors do is they make the world go round. They put plots from an architectural schematic or an urban planning schematic. They put those plots from paper onto Earth. Okay. They make everything that we inhabit possible. This is how development happens. It's because the surveyors take the schematic and they point plots on the Earth so that when the constructors come in, when the earth movers come in and put in streets and points for infrastructure and sewage and running water, and then the lots of the houses, and then where the foundation's going to go, this all gets from a surveyor's chart onto the ground, onto the actual ground. And the surveyors are the guys who go out there with this tripod and a scope that has a laser gun on it, and the laser goes to the other end of a circuit and hits a guy holding a prism. And it's actually really cool visually, and you'll see this now that I'm describing it to you. But it's the guys you see on the side of the road, and there's one guy doing this, and there's another guy standing there with an orange vest on, and he's holding this prism rod, and he's actually taking a laser point that is generated by a set of coordinates, a longitude and a latitude, and he's shooting a laser at where that prism is, and the prism is sitting atop a rod that's going to an exact point on the ground, and they're putting points on the ground, and that's where the street corner is going to go.
So if I could make a leap, then this is sort of they're creating a schematic for a neighborhood in a similar way that a screenplay is creating a schematic for a film.
Yeah, I would say that's accurate.
And that is the connective aesthetic tissue to what's happening here in the book.
I would agree. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I would say so. And what happened to me was I came back to Ohio, got hit by this kind of geologic phenomenon that had suddenly landed in the state, or seemed to land in the state overnight. And by sheer coincidence, I got a job as a land surveyor. From an old connection, I needed a job, and I got a job as a land surveyor. And so I was suddenly out on these developments, learning how to do this. It's not exactly as extreme as, for the sake of the eco module, as saying that, I was suddenly going to work in a slaughterhouse or something. But I realized pretty quickly that I was becoming a part of the apparatus that was engineering this phenomenon, and it was really, really fascinating. And at the same time, I mentioned this to you earlier, one of the really idiosyncratic sort of catalysts for my perspective during this time was that, I was reading a lot, and the job was really hardcore. I was working in 100-degree summers, and I didn't do the job that long. I did it for about a year and a half, but it was enough to work through like a 100-degree summer and a 0-degree winter, and work in a lot of suburban situations out on the landscape. And I'm doing this with a couple of other, old survey crew members who are listening to Rush Limbaugh all day on the radio, which would eventually become something else, the world that we know now. They were in the front seat listening to Rush Limbaugh and right-wing politics, and I was in the back seat reading Kafka's The Castle, which is about a land surveyor lost in the labyrinth of the castle. I kind of lost it, like as these sort of idiosyncrasies were compounding, and then I had to figure out what to do about it.
Changing subject here somewhat.
Yeah.
One movie that this book reminded each of us of independently that we talked about on the episode, which we'll hear when it comes out, is David Lowery's A Ghost Story. Are you familiar with that movie?
No, I think of Ghost World immediately, but no, I don't know if, tell me about Ghost Story.
A Ghost Story came out after your book. It came out like in 2016, I want to say, and Casey Affleck early in the movie dies, and he becomes a ghost in the traditional like Halloween costume, like white sheet over the head, and he kind of, for lack of a better word, like haunts the home in which his, now widow, former wife lives. And spoilers somewhat for A Ghost Story, but it's more about again, sort of like your book, where it's more about how you feel and what happens. Like he kind of like gets unstuck in time and has to live through there, like as she moves out, other people move in, like as the world falls apart and rebirths, and like time cycles in upon itself. And just we landed on the fact that like the feelings that your work evoked were so similar to that it almost makes me wonder now, knowing that like this had been in the works for so long. Like I wonder if he had read your work and was inspired. If Lowery read it and was inspired, because like it feels like it's not like plot wise not the same, but just sort of the where time kind of unwinds and time no longer matters. Like it's all kind of happening at the same time or whatever. So I just wondering if you were sort of familiar with that.
I'm not familiar with it. It sounds intriguing, and I love Casey Affleck. But I think it definitely hits on the idea that I was grappling with, was the flattening of time. That the protagonist, to the extent that there is a protagonist, is caught in this, not exactly a time loop, but a flattened timescape, this sort of spectral plane that's generated architecturally, but is also there as an internal landscape. And so if time is flattened, then it may contain loops. You may circle back on yourself or on something else. And that's for sure related to the idea also of being a ghost and inhabiting something that that's definitely related.
So a related question to that is that every time we talk to an author, we like to ask if people really liked The Glacier and want to continue either reading or, especially in your case, watching movies or TV or any kind of other media that either evokes similar qualities or that you just particularly like or that you think are thematically relevant. What would you point people toward if people want to sort of continue their trek of, if The Glacier is the starting point, what else would you suggest people consume to sort of, and they can also have nothing to do with your book. They just might be things that you particularly love.
Or what might The Glacier be in conversation with? Other works.
It's a good question. In this case, could be a very broad question, I think. On one end of the spectrum, there's a lot of works of theory that I think are in conversation with it. Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle.
You mentioned that. You mentioned that a little bit earlier. Society of the Spectacle,
and sort of what happens late in the movie, the transition from outside to inside. Jean Baudrillard's In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities, which deals with the idea of whether there's a mass or not. A mass of people. Like, do the masses exist, or are they generated? Are they engineered? And the thesis of his book is that in fact the masses do not exist. it's something that's generated for us as a psychic object. And so how does that happen? Paul Virilio's The Anatomy of Fear, I think on the other end of the spectrum, this was really sort of turning of the millennium specific, both in regard to the landscape and the specific time and place, but also what now feels very brief, pre-internet feeling, this sense that at the turning of the millennium that there was something coming, and we didn't know what it was, but we were certain it was coming. Mm-hmm. And that there's a very apocalyptic quality to this feeling and this sort of viewpoint. So, I mean, I was really influenced really early on by The Day After, the television movie that dramatizes, Cold War apocalypse in the U.S. It's certainly in conversation with that. But in the 90s, as a very specific period, the first time I saw Dead Man by Jim Jarmusch,
oh, that's interesting.
Really rearranged my thinking about what movies could be. I felt like at the time I'd never seen a movie like Dead Man.
Plus that Neil Young score. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's all there. The movie to me is a perfect movie. Yeah. And the mythic journey that's taken the journey that's taken through a certain sense about American mythology. I think it's in conversation with Dead Man, both content-wise and structurally.
I love that.
I hope. At the same time, I was really influenced, I think, by The Thin Red Line, Terrence Malick's film at the time, and sort of seeing I was familiar with Terrence Malick's work and sort of knew how he operated, but when The Thin Red Line came out, the way that there's a nature documentary happening while a war happens to be going on, and the way that is complemented by, the specific Terrence Malick style of internal voiceover dialogue.
Also Malick taking the James Jones novel and like vivisecting it and then like doing his Malick thing entirely to it, taking out a lot of the like plot driven stuff and making it into his voiceover heavy poetics.
Yeah. And also elliptical storytelling within a superstructure where there's not really an overarching plot other than the nature documentary and the war. Yeah. So you have these mini elliptical structures happening in this superstructure, and the voiceover kind of provides this metadata to it. And I became really interested in the idea, what if you could take that kind of metadata and make it sort of a little bit more alien? What if it's kind of like it's being voiced over by a psychopathic AI and not by necessarily an empathetic protagonist?
It's very strange because we were actually right before recording this, we were having a conversation about Days of Heaven.
Because I watched it for the first time last night, so it's fresh in my mind.
Oh, wow.
And like we were talking about, that movie has always been a absolute puzzle to me because it is a masterpiece. Yeah, it is it feels like a masterpiece to me. And I cannot figure it out because it is essentially Richard Gere standing in a field of wheat while a girl does whispery voiceover. That is, you can't really even understand what she's saying. And somehow it just works.
Yeah.
I can't figure it out.
Yeah. But it's because he shoots at 5 a.m. Every single thing is shot at 5 a.m, and that's why it works. No, it's great. I mean, Sam Shepard's great. Richard Gere is incredible.
Yeah.
But you're right. There are these things in it that maybe shouldn't work. And in some of his later movies, they don't because he wasn't able to pull it off or he'd done it too many times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But in Days of Heaven, they work.
I want to go back to what you were saying. And I think this is, maybe possibly a depressing note to end on. And I think that framing this as like a 90s novel and the fear of the millennium makes sense. But I think there's also something unfortunately, like a timeless quality to it. Cause I still look around where I live now and I see all these townhouse developments getting put up now. And I'm like, who's living there? Relatively in the middle of nowhere. It's who can afford these? Who's living here? How are there this many people? And so I think that's something that there's sadly like a timeless quality to just like, there can't possibly be people to sustain all of this infrastructure, but I guess there is, because we just keep buying more and more and more.
Yeah.
But I think that might be why it informs the environmental thing. Like, you as the author might be coming at it from a different perspective, but like for now it's the same thing. It's just like, how does this keep happening?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, for me, it really had to do with this very specific time and place toward the toward the end of the 90s. But certainly, I was really interested and 100% conscious about wanting to use that, the artifice of that phenomenon, that architectural phenomenon that you're describing as maybe timeless. I wanted to use it as a frameworking for a way to look at other aspects of the culture that might also be timeless. So what's the mythic structure that's here at work that's either being violated or reinforced, that's actually going to have real consequences in the society, but I want to look at them in the specific moment that the fever dream is happening, So There's all of these, there's the Trinity test is there. The nuclear explosion, is there in a couple different iterations as a sort of iconographic, looping iconographic fixture or cairn, sort of like a geographic benchmark that this is here. It happened in 1945, and then it happened and happened and happened and happened. But actually, in the culture and within this artificial, or what I came to think of not just as architectural, but as an exoskeletal superstructure, the explosion, the Trinity test, and the nuclear explosion it's a fixture. It's a fixed object, like a piece of land art. So in the book, I sort of put it in relation to another piece of land art that's in Ohio, the Ohio Serpent Mound that the little kid draws in the suburban street through a series of dots that you then drone up over and see the snake eating an egg. It's a piece of land art, and I wanted to position the Trinity test as and the threat of nuclear annihilation as a media event. So it's ecologically adjacent. It's not necessarily what we directly think of as, because it's non-negotiable. Right. So we don't think of it as being ecologically negotiable in the way that we think of climate change or other pressing ecological issues. But I wanted to really look at the way that this persistent threat, this thing that we live with, that we still live with, it's a living with, and I really wanted to look at it as as a monument, like a holographic object that exists, this living with potential catastrophic nuclear threat. And the way that ties into the mythology of apocalypse in the culture. That was another dimension that we really haven't talked about, the way that the architecture and the sort of like glacial character of the architectural movement was like a piece in the puzzle of the apocalypse of America, or the mythology of the apocalypse of America, which is such a huge part of the cultural economy, something that I was really conscious of growing up with, and have in a way only become more and more conscious of as a sort of living with, and that has an aesthetic dimension as much as it has a sort of real dimension.
For sure.
So I don't know. That's a lot of words, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, the aesthetics of apocalypse stuff has, I think it's reflected even in the module that we're talking about. It's gone from being nuclear, which is like almost overwhelmingly aesthetic, right? The mushroom cloud and the eruption of an atomic bomb is almost objectively beautiful, even though it's incredibly destructive. Obviously, it's like in Twin Peaks: The Return, right? David Lynch caught that, like the beauty of that atomic bomb going off, and now like it is caught up in the in some cases, beauty of natural disaster and like rising seas and things like that, even though that is also aesthetically repugnant.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's obviously there's a whole, systemic apparatus of voyeurism with natural disaster and everything that we're able to see all the time now. And man, what was I going to say? Well, that's my next book. I'm doing a book about Lynch's Part 8.
Oh, no kidding.
And it's very it's just wild that he took that up eventually as part of his universe, intersecting with the American phenomenon in that way, and
I guess in a post hoc ergo propter hoc kind of way, it feels inevitable, though, right? That ends up being.
To me, it was really shocking. I mean, first of all, I'd spent so much time thinking about the mushroom cloud as this aesthetically beautiful thing that changed my life when it was broadcast on national television, in 1983, with The Day After. This whole question of, is this fiction or is this real? Is this an aesthetic event or is this a documentary of the future? Like, what, for me, was a whole rabbit hole of what is media and what is apocalypse of mythology. And I mean, on. And then The Road came out eventually years later. And to the point that, okay, this is a real concern. This is, for what it's worth, an ecological concern. But it's also an aesthetic concern. It's also part of the literary lineage of the U.S. and the visual lineage of the U.S., as you said, as a beautiful, horrifying, beautiful thing. And so when Lynch did it, it actually really, really shocked me. I mean, I found it so moving, so spectacularly beautiful and moving that it was overwhelming the first time I saw it. I couldn't believe he did it, and then he did it so spectacularly, so perfectly that, and then Oppenheimer came out, and then Cormac McCarthy's 2 new novels, which all completely center on the Trinity test. So the whole cultural object, as I described it earlier, is now getting this really, is getting this treatment in the culture again as something. And when Lynch did it, I just felt like, man, this is.
Well, I think when he did it, I think what's really wild to me is that there was, like, before The Return came out and then after it aired, they wrote books, like I think it's called like The Secret History of Twin Peaks, like parts 1 and 2, and like the second one's like case stories. But like somehow he is able to tell this story about like the nuclear bomb and then also tie it into characters in Twin Peaks. Like how do you do that? Like what? How?
He's a wizard.
Yeah.
Like, but if you like, what's weird? Like I don't want to like say like you need to read this book for homework, because like the book to me, like reading before the show came out, made no sense. Like I was like, I don't understand how any of this has to do with like, it's like the history of like alien sightings in like the New Mexico. And I'm just like, okay, like I don't right. And then you see him do it. I'm like, oh, like he had a plan all along, and somehow this like avant-garde think piece, black and white, whatever, just fever dream actually makes sense within the world. It's just like, I don't what okay, sure.
It was really, really bonkers. I mean, since we're talking about the glacier, there's this sequence in the glacier where Jonah's in his storage unit and he sees a tiny nuclear explosion happening over and over again inside the center of the storage unit. It's the middle of the winter, he's cold, and this tiny nuclear explosion is going off, providing a heat source as this sort of hallucinatory moment among many hallucinatory moments in the book. So I had written this, encounter with a tiny nuclear explosion, and soon thereafter, a cockroach crawls into his mouth and descends to his gut. And then the story goes on from there. And then in The Return, Lynch engineered a tiny nuclear explosion, and then shortly thereafter, a strange creature crawls in that woman's mouth. And I was really like, what's going on here? Like, I don't for a second associate myself with Lynch's process, but it really made me question like what he says all the time, which is that the ideas are out there.
Right.
Like the ideas exist, and it's our job to go and find them and catch them or something. And I thought, my God, this is crazy. This is really, 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 really wild.
So that's what you're writing about now? You're writing about specifically part 8?
I am writing specifically about part 8 as part of a film series that's going to come out called Time Codes, where different authors are taking a film, and a single film, and writing about it minute by minute.
Wow.
So a handful of a bunch of authors are each taking a film and treating it minute by minute as a sort of like sitting with or a viewing with, and writing about the film minute by minute.
What press is putting that out?
What's that?
What press is that on?
Bloomsbury.
Cool.
It's with Bloomsbury Academic. So it's kind of a big house.
Yeah.
That Nick Rombies, who wrote for $2 Radio and also for Clash, he's curating the series and editing it as a kind of boutique series within the Bloomsbury sort of vastness. But yeah, I'm gonna do part 8.
Very cool.
So that's what I'm working on now.
Yeah, all I've broken down minute by minute is the Fast and the Furious, which feels less rewarding than a David Lynch thing.
Well,
but
this is really starting to scare the crap out of me because just.
But that's good. It means that means you're onto something, right?
I hope so. But yeah, it's a bit terrifying. It's a bit daunting, but it's also an opportunity. So.
Can I invasively ask about the Post-it notes in the background? Is that are you doing a very typical writerly thing of structuring via putting Post-it notes on a thing?
Yeah, actually not at all. I'm just in our living room, and at some point my son had done these drawings, and they've been up here for a long time. That's and cool. Actually, when I set up the computer and saw that they're in the background, I was like, oh no, this is going to look like this is going to look too coded. Or something like
it looks like you've created an episode of Saturday Night Live, and each one is like a sketch, and you're gonna take
So what you don't know is that we're here now, and we're going to be here soon.
Or are we unstuck in time, and like none of those are actually in order, and they're all happening at the same time?
Yeah.
The last question we have for you, we play a little fast and loose with copyright, and so each episode ends with a musical outro. Is there a song that reminds you of the Glacier, or maybe that you listen to while writing or editing it, or just a song that you like that you want to take us out in this episode?
Oh man, I listened to a lot of different things over the years of sort of like working on it in its different iterations, but lots and lots of different things.
Or should we just do the Twin Peaks theme song?
Or like no. I wouldn't want you to do that because. Also, I was also really careful not to ever, you got to be really careful with influences that are so strong and iconographic. Yeah. And I wasn't hugely influenced by Twin Peaks at the time. I've become more so since then. And just as a long way around answering your question, I think Lynch at the time showed me what you could do, showed me what was possible, that you could do things, and showed us what you could do with nature. That you could still write about and film about and talk about nature in a way that was captivating and mysterious and idiosyncratic and personal and weird and also mythic. And so I'm a total Twin Peaks head, but I was always very careful with this about sort of like,
For sure.
I think Powderfinger by Neil Young.
I love it. One of my favorites.
Neil was a big part of this sort of landscape adjacent arts movement that I grew up in Ohio, and the Dead Man soundtrack was always sort of living large behind that and behind this. And the character of Gunner, who plays the sort of most rednecky surveyor, and the big bear of a guy in the Glacier, who gets eventually reamed by the deer going through the windshield. I always imagined him being played by Neil Young.
Oh, I should also say, I've also had people bully me into sharing my writing. And, like, you know, there's a scene where he's like, because he's writing everything down, and the guy's like, tell us what you're writing, right?
Read it.
Yeah. I've been there. I've been like an artsy 16-year-old and a jock is like,
yeah, well, this is one of those moments of like, what are you doing that needs to be written down, that is so secretive, and like what black magic is happening in there.
Yeah.
And then to sort of take the liberty that, oh, maybe it is black magic for a minute, and it actually gets him.
Yeah, that's one of the most affecting moments when he kicks them out of the car and then is like, all right, get back in the car.
Yeah.
There's something about that it got me right in my little, like, 16-year-old writing in a notebook heart.
Yeah, nice. Nice. Yeah. So I don't know. There's a lot of things I could go with, but I think Neil Young's Powderfinger.
No, it's perfect. It brings it back around. We did a Herald, like they say in sketch.
One of my favorites, Powderfinger.
But Jeff, thank you so much for joining us and for writing The Glacier. We both really, really liked the novel. And so thank you for your time today and for writing the book.
I really appreciate the opportunity to meet you guys and talk with you about it. So thanks very much for having me do this.
All right. We look forward to reading about The Return.
Yeah.
Coming up, I hope.